me to speak on this topic. It has been a joy for me to do this research, and the reason I titled the presentation as I did, Revelations, things were not as I thought they would be when I first got the book. So not long after Howard and I moved here, the Chandor celebration occurred in 1999. And I was participated in the planning of that event and was totally immersed in Douglas Chandor and his art and the gardens. So when I discovered the Chandor guest book being offered on eBay in around 2000, 2002, from someone in California, I felt like it needed to come home. And I paid about $200, I think it was $200 for it. Fortunately, nobody else wanted it. So I got it for the asking price. The eBay ad had a few of the interior pages, which were tantalizing. I think the Roosevelt signatures were there and some others that I recognized, but it wasn't until they actually arrived and I got my hands on it that I really started to explore it. And it's sitting over here so you can see it, but it's just a plain little book. Yeah. Anyway, there is a number, it looks like an accession number on the inside cover, and I think it must have been sold when the Chandor estate was sold, and that's how, I don't know how it found its way into to California. But once I got my hands on it, I looked through the pages. I'm going, I don't know very many of these people. They're coming from all over the world. Well, who are they? Why were they with the Chandors? Were they portrait clients? Other artists, gardeners? Did the guest book stay in Weatherford? Did people come here, or did the guest book travel with them? Were all these folks visitors to Weatherford? So anyway, last fall there was a speaker here at Chandor that had done a lot of research on Douglas Chandor, and I brought it for him to see, and members of the foundation were here as well. And that, because I had retired and had a little more time, I started to delve into the signatures, and the revelations began immediately. So to set the stage, let's recall Douglas and Ina were married in 1934, and this home was completed, and this studio was completed in 1936. And I want to compliment and thank Harold Lawrence for being such a wonderful resource to me in the last months. And I keep asking him, can I come one more time? So I asked him, I said, well, was the garden completed that? I mean, what was the garden just beginning at that point? He said, oh no, the bowling green was complete, the pixie garden, the alcove on the north side of the studio, and the initial Dova's Walk, I think, was in at that time, probably too. What we're left to finish were the driveways, the pond, and the mountain, and the gray garden. So what I failed to say is the guest book ranges from 1937 to 1963. So people started to come shortly after they moved into the house. So let's get started. Okay. The pages are numbered because many of them have come loose, and I wanted to be able to keep them in original order. So the signatures start on page 3 because there are 2 blank pages before. So Vera Britton is right at the top from Chelsea, London. Chelsea in London. And then if you look most of the way down, there is a very elaborate signature that just Blanche! Exclamation point, New York. I thought, well, this is going to be interesting. And somebody had penciled in Yurka, so Blanche Yurka. What I didn't realize until I got into the middle of this was these ladies and the ladies that were with them were all here on the same day, okay? So Vera Britton was a nurse. She was a writer, a feminist, and a pacifist. She interrupted her Oxford education to become a voluntary aid detachment nurse in World War II. This was in England. She lost her fiance, her brother, and several friends in that war, and it led ultimately to her being a pacifist. She married in 1925 and then went to London because she wanted to get involved in the London literary scene. She wrote a number of books, Her third one, The Testament of Youth, which was completed in 1933, was an autobiographical study of the years 1900 to 1925, and prompted the lecture tour that ultimately brought her to Fort Worth. So her next book, Honorable Estate, in 1936, attempts to show the changing post-war attitudes towards feminine freedom and its impact on individuals. The first one, she talks about the greatest achievements of the post-war period had been the liberation of women and the freedom of thought and speech, and that fascism was the greatest post-war threat. Anyway, she spoke at TCU on a Thursday, October 28th, as part of the TCU lecture series. So you can see her photo on the left, right? And you can, and Blanche and two other ladies, she's very flamboyant, is pictured in the from the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. She was an opera singer, stage and film actress and director. She was an American actress who had then enacted more Ibsen than any other. When she arrived, she was the guest of honor at an afternoon tea, which is held on October 28th at the Rivercrest home of Mrs. J.W. Mitchell. They were here on the 29th of October, and she was invited to stay for the steeplechase ball. She was also invited to dinner on Sunday evening, and she was, the real purpose of her coming was to speak at the Fort Worth Lecture Foundation that met at the First Methodist Church in Fort Worth on Monday, November 1st. Her program included excerpts from the cream of her best roles from over 20 years on the New York stage, classical Greek dramas, Shakespeare, Dickens, Ibsen, and Maxwell Anderson, which was a modern playwright that I wasn't familiar with. She was very well received. Belle Burney introduced her, and you'll see Belle's signature later, and she also spoke in Denton. So some of the other signatures on that page include Ruth Guggins Roosevelt, who was married to Elliott Roosevelt, a son of FDR, Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. She's pictured here with Elliott in 1933 in Fort Worth, shortly after their marriage. And this is the portrait that Douglas Chandor did of her in 1940. Josephine Herbert was also in the group with Vera and Blanche. She signed the book Josephine Herbert and Her Jack. She was, let's see, her husband, Jack, was an oil executive who died in New Guinea in 1942 and is buried in the Philippines, interestingly enough. Josephine later married an oil executive named Bruno Graf, but her name keeps popping up. So she was very active in cultural and civic affairs, social affairs in Fort Worth. There are some additional signatures, two from three ladies from Dallas. One of them is Sally Gibbs Slaughter, who was the former wife of Sam Milliken from Weatherford. Mary Lou Honey was the wife of B.N. Honey, who was a publisher of the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. Evelyn Wildman was visiting Fort Worth. It sounded like she had been a Fort Worth resident at one point because she was, even though she was from California, she was visiting old friends and making new. And the signature on the bottom is interesting because it's signed Fan Chu from China. And I'm going, And then when I was reading Harold's book again, Ina's best friend during her first marriage was Fanny Chu. Oh. So anyway, I think that's a little bit of a joke. But let me just back up to this page. Okay, so they came out for a visit. So Mary Sears was the social arts columnist for the Star-Telegram. And about exactly a year later, she reviewed Vera Britton's Thrice a Stranger, in which Vera Britton describes her 3 trips to the U.S., including her Texas experience the year in 1937. She specifically mentioned the Chandor visit. She complained about the monotony of the drive from Dallas, the autumn heat, being crowded into a small car, and implied if she could skip the open spaces of Texas, so much the better. Of Chandor, she was a luncheon guest and expressed surprise at meeting the president's daughter-in-law, and still greater surprise when she was invited to lunch at the White House. So Blanche Yerka was in Fort Worth the same day. They had the same inconvenience with the car and the weather, but she instead wired for a dress to wear to the steeplechase and enjoyed the hospitality extended to her. Mary Sears felt it would be fair not to ever offer Miss Britton another lecture tour, and being a celebrity exacts so much effort on her part. In essence, it'd just be better for her to stay home. So there, Vera. Okay. So the next page, page 4, the dates are February through May 1938. The celebrities here are Everett Marshall, the third signature from the top, and then the Grand Duchess Marie, who just says she was here in March 1938. So Everett Marshall turns out to be a really interesting guy as well. He was a singer and actor who performed at the Metropolitan Opera, in Broadway revues and early musicals. He came to Fort Worth to perform at Casa Manana at the Frontier Centennial in 1936 and 1937, and he stayed for a very personal reason. Just a few days before visiting here on February 13th, 1938, and I'm talking just days before, his divorce from his wife Carolina was final in Tarrant County. He couldn't leave the county or he couldn't change his residence from the county because his that divorce was not recognized in New York State where his ex-wife lived. But on September 1938, he married again, this time to dancer Edna Strong at the home of Seth and Ona Barwise, who visited with him on the same day here at Chandor. So, and interestingly, and when I was reading more about him, this was not his last marriage. He married 2 or 3 other times. Okay, now Grand Duchess Marie, there's quite a bit to say about her. She was a Romanov. She lived from 1890 to 1958. She was the granddaughter of Alexander II of Russia, the paternal first cousin of Tsar Nicholas II, the last Tsar of Russia, and the maternal first cousin to Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, the consort of Elizabeth II. She was also the first grandchild of George I of Greece and the first great-grandchild of his father, Christian IX of Denmark. So she had a lot of turmoil in her early life. Her mother died when she was only 2, and then her father married a commoner and was banished from Russia. So she was married in 1908, and that ended in divorce in 1914. And during World War I, she served as a nurse until the fall of the Russian monarchy in February 1917. She married again in September of that year, and the couple escaped revolutionary Russia through Ukraine in 1918. So as an exile, she lived in Bucharest and London, and by 1920 she was in Paris, where she opened Kitmer, which was an embroidering fashion establishment. She divorced her husband in 1923, sold the business, and immigrated to the US. And while she lived in New York City, she wrote 2 books, The Education of the Princess in 1930 and The Princess in Exile in 1932. She was very unhappy when the US became allies with Russia in World War II, and even though she was American, she became an American citizen, she moved to Argentina and then returned to Europe permanently in 1949. So she was here to speak on that same lecture foundation tour that Blanche had been here for. And now the meeting had moved to Rivercrest Country Club. She spoke on Monday, March 21st, 1938. Her lecture contrasted the pomp and ceremony of Russia and other European countries with conditions as they were at the time, and it included her early life in the imperial court, World War I, the revolution, as well as trying to build a new life in England, France, and the US. She was warmly received and said to be charming, utterly modern, feminine, as well as a well-rounded individual. So she was entertained by Josephine and Jack Herbert on the evening of the lecture and invited to visit the Chandors in Weatherford on the 22nd of October, and then went on to Dallas on the 23rd. Apparently, Belle Burney was, in the book, Belle Burney records the date as the 21st. That appears to be incorrect. We do that all the time on our checks, right? And she was hosted by Mrs. Frank Hayes McFarland, Carrie Edelman McFarland, who lived in Linda Murdoch's and Mary's house. She grew up there. The Edelmans built that house. So anyway, but she, from 1905 on, she lived in Fort Worth. Okay. So other signatures on that page is Rene Seligman, who signed it in February 24th of 1937. He was an art dealer. He worked for his uncle Jacques Seligman in Paris and New York, and later had his own gallery. The woman's signature underneath was illegible. I could not find anything about her. Ethel DuPont Barksdale Wack she and her husband lived in Santa Barbara, California. They were here on March 27th, 1938. She was a portraitist and the great-granddaughter of the founder of DuPont Chemical, and she was born in Delaware. So there's a picture of Ethel and her husband John with one of their racehorses. This was at the Australia Derby in 1952. The horse Deep River won the Derby there that year. And the smaller painting is one of her paintings as well. So she had an interest in being here to meet Douglas as a fellow portraitist. Her husband was a stockbroker, rancher, horseman, and son of the founder of Field and Stream magazine. That's about all I know about them. The next signature is that of Albert Bruce Crutcher, Jr., and this is one of the most interesting stories to me. He was only 18 years old when he visited. He was born in 1920, and he was born in Mineral Wells, the son of a prominent dentist who had H.L. Hunt as a client and a friend. He grew up in the DFW area, had an innate talent for drawing and painting, a child art prodigy. By his early teens, he was producing impressive gallery quality portraits and working summers as a roustabout in the East Texas oil fields. So he enrolled in Yale University School of Fine Arts in 1940, so that was just 2 years after he visited. And in 1943, he enlisted in the Naval Air Training and was assigned to the Marine Corps as a pilot in the South Pacific. Once the war was over, he returned to Yale and graduated with his art degree in 1946. Well, things turned for him in 1948 when his father died. And for financial reasons, he realized he needed to get a paying job instead of relying on a promising art career. So he became a landman for Humble Oil and was transferred to New Orleans, and later went into partnership with J.D. Tufts, forming the Tufts-Crutcher Corporation, a successful oil and gas exploration and real estate endeavor for over 33 years. He did paint. I did find some of his portraits online, but I was not able to capture them. There was some really weird format that I was not able to deal with. And then Louise Fant McFarland was the last signature on that page. She didn't date her signature, but I'm guessing it was near the time, 1938. Of course, she lived at 508 South Lamar, Linda Murdoch's and Mary's home, and was a good friend of, just down the street, and she was a good friend of Ina's as well. Okay. The next page has only 2 signatures on it. Mario Corbell is at the top, and then Boke Carter was at the bottom. So Corbell was born in Bohemia. He was a sculptor, and he began studying sculpture while he was still there. He came to the US in about 1900 and continued his study here and in Berlin, Munich, and Paris. He was in Fort Worth for 2 weeks, staying with Josephine and Jack Herbert of Rivercrest. He had already completed 2 busts for their daughters, Joyce and Joanne, and he was there to study the western hill slope of their residential property, planning sculpture for the landscaping. While he was there, he spoke and praised the art education program of the National Committee for Art Appreciation being conducted in Fort Worth and surrounds by the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. And that program had just started in that late September. He signed the guest book, God Bless You in Your Dreamland, and isn't it indeed a dreamland? Whoops, I always forget. Here he is, a bigger picture of him. Okay, Boke Carter. Has anybody heard of Boke Carter before? Well, he's kind of an interesting character. He was born in what is now Azerbaijan. Carter grew up in the UK. Came to the US in September of 1921. He began to work as a journalist with the Philadelphia Daily News and began broadcasting a rugby game at a television, or maybe a radio station, WCAU in Philadelphia. He became a naturalized US citizen in 1934. In 1931, he became narrator for the Hearst Metrotone newsreels and continued with WCAU with broadcasts distributed through the CBS network. Well, he was quite a controversial figure, gained a lot of fame, and he was criticizing FDR, the New Deal, and his New Deal program, plus the labor organization, the Congress of Industrial Organizations. Did not go over well. So FDR, I think, actively campaigned against him, and in 1938, he was fired from WCAU, barred from CBS, and lost a profitable General Mills sponsorship. So now there was no popular radio commentator opposed to the FDR foreign policy. So he went on a lecture tour. So he was fired. This is all in early 1938, and he was here in November, November 21st. So the Chandors hosted Carter during the Texas leg of his tour, and he was, on Monday, November 21st, he was interviewed by the same Miss Mary Sears of the Fort Worth Star-Telegram on a KGKO radio right from this residence, and she was in hopes of drawing out the human side of this famous talker. Both Carter and Chandor had English roots, and incidentally, both Carter had a little known talent in portrait painting, so they had that in my, whoops, what did I do? Okay, I'm back, okay. I saw which button you were pushing, Eileen, so I hope I pushed the right one. So on November 22nd, Carter went to Fort Worth to lecture for a town hall meeting at the Temple Beth El, Israel. The topic was free speech on the news. He also would go to Dallas and Houston and remain the guest of the Chandors throughout that time, through November 28th. So as you can see, his signature includes a clipping from the newspaper and then some handwritten script. I'm going to read you first. Well, first he says, "Hello, everyone, bug scuffle time, Boat Carter speaking." I'm guessing was his sign-on to his radio broadcasts. The newspaper said, "Boat Carter, former radio commentator and widely known American reactionary, turned down the presidential suite at the Baker Hotel Monday night and drove over to Weatherford to spend the night with friends before speaking in Fort Worth Tuesday night." We can understand why Carter would be uncomfortable in the presidential suite, and now that we know more about him and his opposition to FDR, we understand more. Okay. And then he still goes on. He said, "And what a first-class ass I should have been not to have turned down the presidential suite. With fireside chats, such abodes have become distinctly de trop. More especially when the door of an honest man's home stands wide and welcome in Weatherford, making therefore that home a king's palace, so much more comfortable than a mere presidential suite. God bless you both, you and Ina, and for as long as you keep close to the earth, you'll both be regular, as Lewis says." I don't know who Lewis is. And as for Dova, well, what a gal, what a vocabulary, and what a lousy poker player. But swell just the same, Boat Carter. So we're getting some insight of things that happened while people were visiting here. Okay. All right, so there are, in essence, 3 signatures on this page. Tomas Mann and his wife Katya, George Bannerman Dealey, and then Ginny O'Toole. And there's Harriet Doan from Massachusetts, couldn't find anything about her, sorry. Okay, the Manns, Thomas Mann, they visited here on March 22nd, 1939, was a German novelist, a short story writer, a social critic, a philanthropist, essayist, and winner of the 1929 Nobel Prize in Literature. He was also nominated for a second Nobel Prize in 1948. So he was a member of a German merchant family He fled to Switzerland when Hitler came into power and immigrated to the US with the aid of his publisher, Alfred Knopf, when World War II broke out in 1939. He moved to Princeton, New Jersey, and began teaching at Princeton. He later moved to California and became a naturalized citizen in 1944. He is one of the best-known exponents of German literature written in exile in opposition to the Hitler government. He spoke, guess where? The Fort Worth Lecture Foundation, again, meeting at Rivercrest Country Club on March 22nd, the same day he was here. His topic was the problems of freedom. He said socialism and democracy are twin brothers. Both rise out of the Christian belief and love for mankind, with democracy putting the accent on freedom and socialism on equality. Democracy is the political expression of the Christian feeling for life, but the democratic concept must never include the freedom to destroy democracy. So another Mrs. Burney, it's B-E-R-N-E-Y, not B-U-R-N-E-Y, of Rivercrest, hosted the Manns during that stay. And Mrs. Bert Honey, which we met on page 3, hosted a luncheon for them at the club following the lecture. He signed the guest book, Thankful for Charming Hospitality. His wife, Katja, was born in Munich to one of Germany's wealthiest families, and to see pictures of her home, it was palatial. Her father was a mathematician and an artist. Her mother was an actress before her marriage. Katja was the mother of 6. She became manager of her family, navigated their frequent moves throughout Europe into the US, as well as keeping an eye on her husband's business affairs, the publishers, and ran the business side of his author's work. She wrote a book also, Unwritten Memories, Katja Mann, which was published in 1974. She lived until 1934. I guess it was published after she passed. Okay. So George Betterman Dealey has a story similar to Amon Carter and other rags to riches stories that you hear. He was the publisher of the Dallas Morning News and owner of the Belo Corporation, and very much a civic leader. He was born in England, surprisingly, and the family immigrated to Galveston in 1870, and George soon took over his older brother's job as an office boy at the Galveston News, owned by the Alfred H. Belo, and he took that job in 1874. Well, he worked his way up in the company and started the Dallas Morning News in Dallas in 1885. He was its manager by 1895, a board member in 1902, and vice president and general manager of the corporation in 1906, and its president in 1919. In 1926, he bought the Dallas Morning News and 2 other papers, and the Dallas Morning News is also, and still does publish the Texas Almanac from the Belo heirs, along with the majority of the company stock. He also founded WFAA Radio in 1922. So he had his, as you can see, his portrait made by Douglas Chandor, and the occasion was his 65th anniversary with the Belo Corporation. Most of the sittings were right here in this room. The port was finished in early May of 1939. So, and this portrait hangs at the Dallas Arboretum in the Dealey mansion there. It's over the fireplace and the library, and when we go and I ask the docent, tell me about that portrait, they don't know, so I have to help them. That should be definitely part of the docent training. Okay. James St. Lawrence O'Toole was an art dealer and a gallery owner. He was Irish. As an art dealer, he was associated with Jacques Seligman in Paris and New York, then the Paul Reinhardt Gallery, and opened his own gallery on East 51st Street, later the O'Toole Ewald Gallery. He worked really hard to help Douglas get commissions for paintings for my friend Harold. And Harold also indicated that O'Toole was Chandor's sponsor when he moved to the US from England. He also wrote, I can do this without tripping. The biographical introduction to Chandor's portraits, which was published in 1942. If you haven't found a copy, you need to. It's beautiful. So he wrote, here's to the Lord of the bowling green and the hedges grand and flowery, to the blossoming pond with the golden fish and the blooms along the bowery. I leave with regret, but fondly hope with spring's returning glory, I'll be asked again to rejoice my host in this, the pussycat's glory. Jimmy O'Toole, the 11th of June, 1939. Did they like cats, Harold? Yes, okay. Okay, I call this the Roosevelt page. It's page 7. And so there are signatures here of Sarah Delano Roosevelt, Ethel DuPont Roosevelt, the wife of Franklin D. Roosevelt Jr., Elliott Roosevelt, Eleanor Roosevelt, and Grace Tully. So as you can see on the bottom of that slide is the 1935 portrait that Douglas did of FDR. So for Sarah, Elliott Roosevelt invited Douglas to a dinner for his grandmother, Sarah Roosevelt. Did that happen here, Harold? Or it was in New York? It was in New York, okay. In May 1936. He was invited to Hyde Park, his next trip east, to paint her portrait. It took him 4 years to get there. Some of the settings were at Hyde Park, but most were in their New York City apartment, which was 323 East 57th Street, and pictured here in Life magazine of April 29, 1940. You can see Sarah Roosevelt sitting, Douglas is painting, and Ina is at the piano playing, which I think was her custom to do. And the foundation is trying to raise money to buy a Chippendale-style grand piano for this vase, so because that's what was here. She was very appreciative of Douglas' portrait of FDR, and done in 1935. And just, I hope people will see it, for you've caught the kindness of my son. She wrote A Gala Day. Okay, and there was no year, but because of the timing of the portrait, I'm assuming it's 1940. Okay, Ethel and Franklin Roosevelt Jr. were here. They say, I think this is FDR Jr.'s handwriting, many thanks for the best juleps, bowling, and most important, Miss Dova's broiled chicken, and our congratulations on those family portraits. So at that point, there was the 1935 FDR, then Sarah, the 1940 Sarah Roosevelt picture, and Ruth Guggen's Roosevelt was also done in 1940, and I presume that it was done by this July 12th day, 1940. If not, it was probably in progress. Here's Elliott Roosevelt. I found another photo of he and Ruth shortly after their marriage in 1933. This was in the Guggen's home in Fort Worth. In fact, a lot of these photos come from the UTA Library's digital gallery. You need to explore that sometime. And of course, then I have a small kind of a thumbnail of Ruth's portrait for reference. Elliott writes, and it's not dated, I'm guessing perhaps it was the same day that his brother signed. He said, Douglas and Ina, my darling has been reproduced for posterity better than I could have hoped for. To you, Douglas, for your ability, and to you, Ina, for your inspiration, my heartfelt thanks, E.R. And I wasn't sure who E.R. was, because Eleanor Roosevelt signed right next to that, but I believe it's Elliott that wrote. Okay. Her handwriting is very, very different. So Eleanor Roosevelt, this Chandor portrait was done in 1949. She simply just signed her name with the date and location as New York City on November 25th, 1940. Interestingly, this was the first Thanksgiving that the FDR was able to spend at Hyde Park since he had become elected president. So that gave me the clue that they were indeed in New York at that time. The Roosevelt children, represented by Elliott, commissioned the Chandor to paint their mother's portrait for $15,000. It turned out to be a companion piece to that of FDR, which you'll see in the next slide. The Roosevelts never paid for the portrait. So it remained with the artist until 1968, or with Ina, when the Friends of the White House acquired it for $45,000. He did that. They did better on it, and it is hanging in the White House now. Grace Tully was the administrative assistant to private secretary to FDR. She's not the one that he had an affair with early on. She went to work with him later in his presidency, and you can see a picture of them working together. FDR portrait referred to as the one that he sat for right before he died, completed in 1947, which you see here, completed after his death. It was not the 1935 one that she was referencing. She writes, "It is so nice to visit with Ina and Douglas Chandor, and I adore the FDR portrait. Grace G. Tully," and signed the date January 7th, 1947. So on this page, the standout figure, the signatures are David Cohn, and then William Hood Simpson, who is a Weatherford native. There's the second signature appears to be Von Hull. Cannot find anything about that person. So we're going to talk about David. David was an author and lecturer who grew up in Greenville, Mississippi. He set aside a successful mercantile career in 1934 to write. His first book was called God Shakes Creation, which was expanded to Where I Was Born and Raised in 1947, both focused on the Mississippi Delta. Estimating his encounter with the Chandors between July 1940 and June 1941, because his signature is not dated. He was not on a lecture tour. I didn't find anything about him in the Fort Worth paper, except that his books were mentioned as library holdings. At the time of his autograph, Cohn was living near Yanceyville, Caswell County, North Carolina, and it was, as was documented in a Life magazine article of December 8th, 1941, he had just completed a book called The Good Old Days. So he does sign it, David Cohn, Yanceyville, North Carolina. So, William Hood Simpson was the grandson of attorney and district judge A.J. Hood, who brought his family to the Aledo area in 1856. That's about as early as it gets. He was the first Parker County resident to be appointed to West Point, graduating in 1909. He wasn't the best student, but I think he graduated near the bottom of this class. But he was a highly decorated officer that had an illustrious military career that's way too broad for me to go into here. In April to September of 1941, he was the first commander at Camp Walters, the largest infantry replacement training center, which was in Mineral Wells. He was commanding general of the 9th U.S. Army in Northwest Europe in World War II, and as such was honored with a hero's welcome in Fort Worth and Weatherford on June 26th and 27th, 1945. There's a signature there of Dick Atkins, who was a British Army staff member, Washington, D.C. He was here just a few days before that, and the Wooten Court, I'm not quite sure the reference is, that is to a beautiful home that no longer was torn down many years ago, a country home. So I'm just wondering if he had some affiliation with Hood. General Simpson was forced to retire from the Army in 1946 due to a physical ailment. And in 1954, he was promoted to full general on the retired list and honor passed on by Congress that advanced commanding officers to that rank. And President Eisenhower said that he was very, very worthy of that fourth star. He died in San Antonio in 1980 and was buried with his wife at Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia. So the other signatures there include Fritz Lanham, who was congressman from the area, and also John and Mary Horn, who Major Horn. And as part of the celebration, after the parade, well, let's just go back here. Okay, these are some pictures from the Simpson homecoming. He was greeted at the Fort Worth City Airport. General Simpson is there, the Lanhams are there, Amon Carter is there, and you can see it on the right-hand side of the slide. Amon Carter presented him with a certificate, and not only had Amon Carter signed it, but Fritz Lanham had too. So he had a parade. I mean, it was a big, big deal. And that evening, his mother, still living in Aledo, had a family dinner. And Simpson came out, and the horns were included in that. So that's how I know that they were there and were here at the same time as he visited. So I believe the celebration in Weatherford was on the 27th. You can see the courthouse, and the city was anxious to get ready for this, to honor their hometown hero. And the picture next to it is from the newspaper. UTA has not scanned all of these yet, but I'm going to urge them to do it. He and Mrs. Simpson are eating some peaches. But anyway. Okay. Page 9 is, all the signatures on this page are undated. All of them in the top are some language that I can't read. I don't know if it's some type of Arabic. But the first legible signature is that of Malcolm P. Aldrich. The first, and he and the two people underneath him are both all from New York. Aldrich was a graduate of Yale in 1922, played football, and was inducted to the College Football Hall of Fame in 1972. When he graduated from college, he went to work for managing the Commonwealth Fund. It was a benefactor, a foundation that benefited medical education, and became its president in 1940 and the chairman of the board in 1963. The Hares, Idalia Hare and her husband Morin, I haven't learned too much about. She was born in Boston in 1882. Her maiden name was Levy. She married Hare, her second husband, in May 1920, and the only reference I found to her was that she was an opera singer in 1928. Morin Hare was born in New Jersey. He registered for World War I and World War II. The couple traveled a great deal, and they appear on a lot of different passenger lists. But it appears that he was, the census says he's a broker, and I'm guessing his father was an insurance broker, so I feel that's probably what he was as well. A. Perry Osborne is, and his wife Marie are listed at the bottom of the page, signed at the bottom of the page. They signed Texas, but really the Osbornes lived in New York City. He was a lawyer and the son of a famed paleontologist and the founder of the American Museum of Natural History. They visited his wife's brother, T.H. Cantrell, in Fort Worth not long before this, and he was hoping to return because he had an interest in the Fort Worth Children's Museum. He died in Tucson in March, unexpectedly, in March of 1951. Well, Marie was born, turns out she was born in Fort Worth, so this is making a lot of sense. And that, like I said, they were visiting her brother not long before they came here. She had, Mr. Osborne was her second husband as well. Okay, page 10. A lot of these folks are, the signatures are from Leonie Danforth, and the Whites, Julia and William White, are both from New York City. I didn't find anything on the Whites. Leonie Danforth was married to a surgeon. Her father, Mr. Danforth, was a furniture manufacturer. Lorna Brooks is an interesting person too. She and her husband Alan both signed the guest book in an undated signature. She was born in St. Louis and graduated from library school. She moved to Oklahoma and was a librarian in both El Reno and Oklahoma City. She opened a bookstore in 1927 and wrote a book column for the Oklahoma News. And she was of considerable influence on social, cultural, and artistic life in Oklahoma City, one of the organizers of the English-speaking union there. And for many years, she gave an art prize in memory of her husband at the exhibitions at the Oklahoma Art Center. So you can see that she was involved with the arts. The last signature on that page is Margaret Rozier. I don't know anything about her. Harold said the Roziers were from Dallas. Colin Dunlop was an Anglican bishop. He signed the book on August 31st, 1952, and Harold reminded me that's when Douglas and Ina were in England to paint Queen Elizabeth portrait. Dunlop was ordained after his World War I military service. He had many appointments, but in 1949 he was made the Dean of Lincoln, a post he held until his retirement in 1964. The Dean of Lincoln is the head of the chapter of Lincoln Cathedral in the city of Lincoln, in Lincolnshire, and the Church of England Diocese of Lincoln. And this goes back, the deanship goes back to 1092. So Lincolnshire is considered to be in the Eastern Midlands and is not far from Sheffield. So how they met, I'm not quite sure. All right. The last page I'm going to show you, and this is really the end of the autographs, is Thomas Hart Benton. So very recognizable artist, and also he was visited here with Mary Lou and John Paxton from Fort Worth. Okay, Thomas Hart Benton was a painter, muralist, and printmaker. Along with Grant Wood and John Stuart Curry, he was at the forefront of the regionalist art movement. The fluid sculpted figures in his painting depicted everyday people and scenes of life throughout the U.S. He was born in Missouri. I need to turn the page. Excuse me. And in 1907, his mother encouraged him to enroll in the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. He studied in Paris as well, in Italy and other European countries. And in the early 1930s, became interested in portraying the history of America in graphic form. Pictured here on the bottom is Aeschylus and Hercules, a 1947 mural made for a Kansas City department store, now in the Smithsonian American Art Museum. And the one above is from the Streetcar of Desire. He was a member of Reeves Lewenthal's Associated American Artists, a group Chandor was invited to join but chose not to. And Lewenthal was one of Douglas Chandor, was his early publicist. So he was here in Fort Worth, December 8th, 1963. So this was a full 10 years. Did it go off again? Back? Yes. In December 8th, 1963, they had a reception for him at the Fort Worth Art Center, and the following day he held open forums with the students at both Arlington State College, which is now UTA, and TCU. He was accompanied by his daughter, Jessie Benton Good, who was also an artist. She just passed away earlier this year. Mary Lou Paxton was born in Illinois. She was a fashion director in Chicago before marrying John Paxton, who was from Kansas City. And I was wondering, I don't know if they have any relationship between Benton and the Paxtons that way or not. She was on the board from 1969 to 71 on the board of Burlington Industries with Letitia Baldridge. She was active in the Junior League of Fort Worth, and she is the mother of Bill Paxton, the Fort Worth actor that passed away in 2017. So I'm guessing that she and John were hosting Thomas Hart Benton and visited the gardens with him. So John was a member of the Screen Actors Guild and has very many film credits to his resume. Okay, so that's the end of the signatures. So the signatures went from 1937 to 1963. So after all of this investigation, and I'm not saying it's complete, but hopefully I can figure out some of those other signatures in the future. What did I learn? Well, 5 were signers. 5 signers were the subjects of Chandor portraits. 2 of them came during actual sittings. So you see Dealey, Josephine, Herbert, Eleanor Roosevelt, Sarah Delano Roosevelt, and Ruth Guggens Roosevelt as well. Many of the guests were lecturers, visiting lecturers, okay? So we've got Vera Britton, Blanche Yerka, the Grand Duchess, Mario Corbell, Bo Carter, Thomas Mann, and Thomas Hardbenton. It definitely appears that the guest book did not stay in Weatherford, that it traveled with them, apparently from Weatherford to New York and even to London. Generally, the signers were affiliated in some way with the arts, including artists, sculptors, patrons of the arts, as well as authors, singers, actors, and journalists and broadcasters. We know that a lot of gardeners visited the garden as well, but I don't think that they were probably large groups and did not sign the guest book. I tried to classify the people, were they artists, were they in some other part of the arts, were they authors, singers, actors, broadcasters, whatever. And then I was taking, where did they come from? Well, several of them had Weatherford roots: Carrie Edelman McFarland, Fanny Chu, Louise McFarland, and William Hood Simpson. There were 4 from Dallas and a number of folks from Fort Worth as well. And Harold was telling me that Ina was really actively encouraging people to come, right? And this was probably a way, hopefully, of building their portrait business as well. They not only came from Texas, there were several from California and other states, North Carolina, Oklahoma, Missouri, even some from Britain, directly from Britain. And there were I was surprised at how many guests had UK roots, right? Either England or Ireland. And a lot of folks were in New York and probably visited their apartment and studio while they were in New York City. Let's see. Okay. And my question now is, what more might future research reveal? We'll just have to see. If I come up with anything special, I will ask to come back. But I really would like to thank Harold for his sharing his Chandor archival materials and his expertise on everything Chandor. His book. He was very gracious, and I got to meet, is it Belle? Belle, that's your dog? Annabelle, okay, Annabelle was there with us one day. His book, Douglas Chandor, an English artist in his Texas garden, was a tremendous resource as well. A lot of my research began there. We had the access to the archival materials. There is a collection of Douglas's papers at the DOS, which I have not delved into, but would love to at some point. But I used the internet, Wikipedia, Ancestry, newspapers.com, and to try to build the stories of the people that were here. So I'd be happy to answer any questions, and I encourage Harold to pipe in, because I know he is very knowledgeable about Chandor. Yes?
How did you find it on eBay? Were you looking specifically, or how did you come across it?
I just was, I regularly searched on Weatherford, Texas, and it popped up.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, there it was. It needs to come home. It needs to come home.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, and it's, this was 20 years ago, so it's been sitting in its little box, and the book is over here if you'd like to come look through it. I'd ask you to be careful that some of the pages are loose, so. Okay, any other questions?
We have a question back here.
Yes.
Brenda, thank you so much. I know you spent so much time, and I can see a book coming.
Oh, I don't know, but this kept me up very late at night. I look at my watch, it was 2 o'clock. So.
I think they check into this. I know when Jim Rock was a young congressman, that's when they had speaker, Sam Rayburn, his speaker
Right.
from Austin.
Right.
And Douglas did his portrait there.
Right.
And then when Jim went to Congress, they were really instrumental in getting it, and it hangs in the National Portrait Gallery.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So maybe you could find out a little PS on that.
Oh, on Rayburn? Okay. I asked Harold, I said, is there a complete list of his paintings? And he said no. So there's a list of them in the 1920s and early 30s in the 1930s in the Chandor Portraits book, but it's not complete. Yeah. So, any other questions? You guys are easy.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.